It was just before 2 o'clock, and I was in Central Park waiting for my dog to poop when I realized I wasn't the man I thought I was. It sounds very dramatic, doesn't it? It was January 13th. I went and looked up the date. It was a Thursday. And I was talking on the phone with a former coworker. It was in Central Park. That's about the time I walk Simba. He's our 4-year-old black Shar-Pei that we adopted just about a year ago now. And that's the time where it's dog walkers, usually. There's some people in the park, but it's fairly abandoned. Some school kids sometimes will be, depending on how cold it was. This day it was in the 40s, like cold enough that I was wearing a parka. And I was, as I said, talking to a former coworker using my Beats, my Power Beats Bluetooth headphones, if you must know. So yeah, kind of obnoxious. And it was a conversation just to check up. It had been a little bit more than 4 months since I'd been let go from 710 ESPN Seattle. And it was somebody that hadn't talked to me since then, was just kind of checking to see how I was doing. And he asked, "You've still got your wife's job, right?" And I froze for a second. I could feel kind of the blood rush to my head, like your peripheral vision kind of brightens, like it's an emotional flash, and you're not quite sure what's causing it, but you know that like, whoa, like something happened there. And it had nothing to do with the question. Like the question was super well intentioned. It was really someone who was just sort of trying to make sure that I had some economic footing, because I'd had some freelance work, but the magazine story I wrote for Pacific Northwest magazine hadn't been published yet. I was doing a newsletter, but it was just this question. And I thought a lot about why I reacted that way. And I'm kind of embarrassed. And it's not because of anything I said or did after that, because I didn't do anything. Like I froze for just a second, resumed the conversation, got off the phone. Like it wasn't, but I know what that was. And it was a flash of insecurity or uncertainty, or maybe a little bit of ego that kind of got twisted there. But it was honestly something that I really kind of thought I was past. And I've continued to think about what that means. I'm Danny O'Neill. This is the Dang Apostrophe. It's a podcast tied to a newsletter that I write. If you're interested in some of the perspective I have, and increasingly with the podcast, some of the thoughts I have about myself. Last week we were talking about my need to rein in Twitter fights, and this week I'm going to talk about how it felt to realize that I'm feeling some insecurity over my current job or lack thereof. And like I said, I really thought I was past that, because look, for years I have said to anyone who will listen that we're going to pivot off my wife Sharon's job. There are reasons for that, not just her sort of ambition, but I've bounced around jobs, but I haven't ever stayed happy at a job. Like I've worked now. I've worked at the Seattle Times 3 times. I've worked at the Seattle Post Intelligencer, and now I've worked at 710 ESPN Seattle. And in each case, it's somewhere between 4 and 7 years I start getting antsy. And I think some of that is because I embrace new challenges, but some of that is because I don't think I have the healthiest view toward what I expect from my job. And I mean, going back to before Sharon and I were married, I said that I would be the one that would take on primary childcare responsibilities. This is when we thought we'd have children. Because when we first got married, I think both our expectation was that we were going to have kids. It wasn't something we agreed to do or agreed not to do. I think it was, we both kind of felt that was probably the way. We knew that neither one of us was against having children. For neither one of us was it a deal breaker. And my position then was I'll be the primary childcare provider. My ambition is to write, like my primary ambition, and that's still true. And you can do that part-time. Like you don't need a 9-to-5 job to do that. Like you don't have to work full-time. And more recently, kind of especially as Sharon went to graduate school in 2015, got her MBA, we both talked about sort of the fact that if we moved, it would be for her job. Part of that is because I didn't trust myself to stay happy in a job I moved for. And that would be the worst if you, as a couple, moved and then had the person who precipitated the move become unhappy. That would be very difficult. But also just because I'm still working toward a job that I have and find long-term happiness in. So this idea that my ego or my sense of self was dependent upon being employed or being sort of the quote unquote breadwinner, like it's never been that. It's been several years since Sharon started making more money, and now significantly more money than I did. And I've never felt threatened by that. Like I think that's pretty honest. Like I don't think I'm just saying that. When we were both, because when we met, we were both reporters. We were both in it sounds weird to say now, a 3-year internship. The Seattle Times used to have these 3-year interns, and it was like, honestly, it was a great opportunity to get experience. I was in my 20s and working at a much bigger paper than I would have otherwise, but you didn't make very much money. Like it was definitely, but the experience it worked out very well for me. And Sharon, she started that program earlier than I did, but she was promoted out of it and got a full-time job before I did. I've never been competitive with her. And I tell the joke that like I was smart enough to recognize she's smarter than me. And there's some of that is me playing into a comedy bit or sort of a role. But I've never felt that sort of, I've never felt sort of my ego or my sense of self threatened by her intelligence, her accomplishments, her ambition, like none of those things. Like I really, and that part's true. It's one of the reasons that I feel so lucky to be partnered with her, because I do think that she challenges me in ways, and that I don't feel threatened. It's one of the things that I admire most about her. And so going back to that day in the park, what I realized is that there's kind of this gap between what I said I was ready for and what I was actually feeling. There's a gap between, because when we moved to New York, and even let's go back a little bit before that, because when she was offered the job, she was offered a job in New York. And when we talked about it and decided to take it, because I did have, and she blatantly said, like, we won't move if you don't want to. So it feels weird to say I was given veto power, because that's not really how it worked, but it was very clearly like, we're not going to do this unless I wanted to do it. And I did want to do it. And when she decided to accept the job, I assumed that would mean that I was leaving the radio station. So this is the summer of 2019. I assumed that meant that I was going to be departing. And I went in and talked to my supervisors there, my direct supervisor, and then the person who was the station manager at that point. And pretty quickly, in a day or two, the possibility of me working remotely came up. But that was not something that we did not decide to move with the understanding that I was going to be able to continue to work for the radio station. She accepted the job, and my expectation was that I would be going to New York and starting sort of my own from scratch, figure out what I was going to do, whether that was as a freelance writer, whether that was continuing to piece together some different kind. I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to figure it out, but I was excited about that uncertainty and that possibility. And pretty quickly it was, well, would you be willing to work remotely? Would you consider doing that? And there were a lot of reasons that was attractive to me. The first and primary one being it would kind of smooth my transition, that I wouldn't be moving to a new city with no structure and just a blank slate of here, figure it out in a place that I didn't know, that I would have some time, essentially. And so the agreement was that I would do it for at least a year, give it a shot for at least a year. I ended up doing it for 2. And as last summer was unfolding and there was clearly uncertainty at the radio station about the future of the show that I was working on and what direction I wanted to go as well. It was kind of like, okay, 2 years later, I was going to be making the transition that I expected to make when Sharon first moved to New York back in August, September 2019. That was kind of what I felt was happening. And that's true. That's kind of how it's worked out. I'm figuring some things out. I'm piecing this newsletter and the podcast are part of it. The freelance stories are part of it. Finding clients to write for is part of it. Like there's a lot of really positive things that have happened. It's also uncertainty, right? I haven't done it before, so you don't know if it's going to work out, and you're trying something new and trying to see how the skills I have work in other applications, and that's exciting. There's also some fear with that, and I've tried sort of through the past few months to keep very much in touch with the uncertainty is an exciting part of this. Like it's not good and it's not bad, it just is. And we crave certainty as humans. Like this I guess I'm going to reference Pema Chodron. She's a Buddhist nun, and she's written a number of books. Things Fall Apart is a beautiful one. Living Beautifully is the one that I've read most recently, and it is about finding beauty in transition. One of the points she makes is that we fear change as humans. Like generally, like all the phrasing, I just need to get my feet back on the ground. I just need to get things settled. Once things mellow out here, once I find my footing, all of these phrases are part of our desire to find stability and feel confident about what we're experiencing. Yet a fundamental nature, like an unavoidable reality of being human is uncertainty, right? Like we're constantly dealt and have to face changes we didn't anticipate. We're kind of constantly in a state of flux, and we fear that. But if you can accept it, there can be a beauty in that uncertainty too. I find this to be a very inspiring thought so I could be afraid that this transition, I'm not going to be able to find consistent enough work, or I'm not a good enough writer to have people buy my work by the piece, or left to my own devices, I don't have the ambition or the inner drive to be able to consistently produce without a deadline. Like all of those things, look, those are fears. Those are possibilities. On the flip side, every fear that I have should have at least as much and probably more opportunity. It might turn out that my work is much more valuable than it ever was when I was working on a staff somewhere. It might turn out like actually having control of the marketing of my work might open doors that I didn't think were there. The fact that I don't have to write or discuss material that I'm expected to do because that's within my job, the fact that I get to determine my own subject matter might be more fulfilling for me than anything that I've ever done before. I might find happiness in this, which I haven't been able to maintain in other jobs that I've had. So that's been sort of one of the underlying challenges for me, is to keep and embrace the uncertainty that's there. What I was surprised at, and what came out in the conversation with the former coworker, was that I do feel and have a little bit of insecurity about being sort of the caboose or the trailer that's attached to my wife's economic locomotive. And I really thought I was past that. And this isn't meant to be sort of a beating myself up over sort of my inner chauvinist being emerging. I think it does show how deeply embedded gender roles and gender norms are, even for someone like me. That, like, I would say that that's been a point of pride for me, that I have worked to not find myself beholden to those and those expectations. And I think a lot of the decisions that I've made as an adult reflect that, whether it is never expecting that my job would be sort of the North Star that Sharon and I navigated by. In fact, resisting that because I knew that there are some issues with sort of my stability at workplaces that between the two of us, it's probably much better to navigate off of hers because she's more stable and I think has a healthier understanding and balance of how she deals with work. Like all of those things are points of pride for me. And to feel that moment of, you've got your wife's job. And there was just this, I could feel my body just kind of like, I was uncomfortable. And is that because it's weird to be economically dependent? Like my health insurance is covered by her job. I'm not paying rent right now. I don't contribute to our monthly rent payment right now. And I haven't done that since I was 19. Like I have not, I remember the last month I didn't pay rent because I was living at home. My stepfather had kidney stones and they were obviously incredibly painful. He was not a pleasant person to be around anyway. And so then he's like very physically uncomfortable. I remember there was one time he came home and you'd feel this sort of pall that would come over my siblings and I when he came in the door. Like it wasn't like there was a mood change. Like that dude, like he exerted like emotional weight. And he came in, kind of looked at us, and I looked back at him. I didn't say a word. And then he went upstairs. And I was like, that's whatever. And then my mom came down. My mom's just the sweetest lady. My mom comes down and she goes, "Don't you think you could say hi to him?" And it's just like, he didn't say hi to me. And it's not fun. It is funny. It's not funny. No, it is funny. Because what she said to me is, do you understand we're dealing with a health situation here that's uncomfortable for all of us? So anything you could do like would be appreciated, which is so sweet of my mom, right? And like in my head, it was like, I'm never living in this house again. Like I've got to kiss his butt when he comes home because he doesn't feel good, which is probably pretty acceptable for a 19-year-old. So that was the last summer I lived at home. Like after that, I never came back. I never lived in that house again. And that's the last time I didn't pay rent. So I'm not doing that right now. And these are all, none of this is surprising. Like this is part of the plan that not just we set out, that I agreed to, that I embraced. And here I am kind of feeling uncomfortable about it. And I don't mind being uncomfortable. And this gets back to sort of that being okay in transition with uncertainty. It means that it's new and it's different, right? There's also something about this that has shown me the gap between intention and action. That the intentions we have, I'm not beholden to my job for my sense of identity, like that's easier to think than it is to feel when you do it. And there are going to be some inevitable feelings that you have. Like, I don't think you can control your feelings. Like, I think you can influence your feelings, but I don't think you can control them. I think there are certain things that happen that have an emotional trigger in you that I think they're always going to happen. Like you can't stop how you feel. If something happens that makes you mad, you can learn how to process that feeling or not act on that feeling. But that, I think of it as like a guitar string that's being plucked. Like when you're emotional, an emotional trigger happens, like you don't have any control over that guitar string being plucked. Now you do have the ability to, after it's plucked, kind of put your hand over it and stop it from vibrating. Or I guess, I don't know enough about guitar to carry this metaphor, so I'm just going to stop. Or you can just sit there and let it vibrate and make this big blaring sound. But you don't have that. So that, whether it's male ego or just sort of that sense of adult responsibility, like that question from that coworker plucked that guitar string. And I felt it. Like I felt it in the moment. Like I legitimately got Simba on the leash, and you kind of felt this, and I didn't act on it at all, but I've thought about it a lot. And that idea of there being this gap between who I thought I was or sort of the principles that I believe I hold, and whether my feelings as I go through this, and it's unprecedented for me. Like, I'm not going to sit here, oh my gosh, there's so much anxiety, because there's not. Like, I'm really, and people deal with really extreme financial stress all the time. I am not dealing with extreme financial distress. Like, I am in an incredibly, like, I have an incredible luxury, privilege, like all of those words that you wanted to, like, I've got some time to figure out exactly how this is going to work. And there's been some encouraging signs so far. There have been some things that are a little more unexpected. I thought it would be easier for me to get bylines with online publications than it has been. But these are all microscopic, like small items of concern. Like, by and large, like, I am happy. I am excited by the uncertainty. I'm having fun doing things. I don't know if this podcast is going to stay in this direction of basically me peering into my soul or my belly button, depending on how worthwhile you think my self-pondering is. But I'm enjoying experimenting with that. Like, I've found over the course, and this is primarily from my time on radio, is that I think that's the way that I've made the strongest connections with people, is a willingness to talk about either errors that I've made, uncertainties that I feel. I mean, all the different stuff, whether it's talking about me having depression and medicated for that, or having a drinking problem, like all those sort of things. Like, I feel being honest about those things is a way it builds connection with people. I don't know if I want to continue doing that, but I'm enjoying that process. And through that, there's some other moments where I feel like I crossed a line I didn't think was there, where I was like, oh, turns out I do have a little bit of anxiety about not being the breadwinner, and imagining what Sharon's coworkers think when they ask what her husband does. And she's like, well, he's got a newsletter right now, and he just got a bunch of stickers made for it. What's his newsletter called? It's called the Dang Apostrophe. Whoa. I have no idea what that means. Like, there's a certain, like, I don't know how all of this is going to turn out. And after thinking about sort of how do I feel about my feelings, how do I feel about the fact I'm a little bit more insecure than I thought, or maybe have a little bit more ego or identity tied up into my job than I thought, I feel excited. I feel excited because this is a chance for me to live a life that is truer to my principles, and to test out the things that I believe about myself, and to see if I am able to live by the beliefs that I think I hold. And if that means that I need to do some things to sort of work on how I respond to some of those uncertainties, or maybe it's just the process of actually doing it and thinking about it in a different way, and realizing that, oh, there is a gap between intention and action. And then wondering if, like, that might be a reason. Like, I'm a white male. I'm a white cis male in America. And I've said and raised I believe that other groups, women, people of color, people of different sexual orientation, different gender, like all of those issues, that I have an incredible amount of privilege. And making sure that I don't have more privilege, or that other people's opportunities match up to mine, might mean that white males get a little less of those latent advantages that have been baked into the system. And it might feel like you're losing something. And maybe it's easier to think I'm ready for a more equitable, egalitarian society than it is to feel like, oh, what about mine? Oh, well, I didn't think it was going to cost me my opportunity. Oh, well, I didn't think going here would be, I just thought I'd go get another job, or all of a sudden people would be lining up to have me write for them. There's a little uncertainty here. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know if I like this. and an opportunity to make sure that my actions match up to my beliefs. Started this by saying that I realized I wasn't the man I thought I was. And this is a chance to be that person, to have my actions and the things that I do actually attest in some ways, but that's not really the right word, because it's putting some of those ideas into action and seeing how that feels. And I believe on the other side of this, I will have the sort of the energy and maybe the feeling of accomplishment that you get when you do something you didn't know if you could do. When I switched to radio in 2013, I didn't know if I'd be good at it. There were a lot of people that thought I was not particularly good at it. And I didn't have ego wrapped up in that. Like, there wasn't, if after a year they'd come to me and said, we really appreciate everything you've done, but we got to go in a different direction here because it's just not working, I would have been bummed. Like, I would have been like, oh, that feels lousy. But it wouldn't have felt the same as if I'd gotten fired as a newspaper reporter. Like, if I'd gotten fired as a newspaper reporter, like, there is definitely, they would have been like, oh my gosh, like, this is what I've invested. That was part of my identity. That was what I really have a sense of self wrapped up in. And that would have caused sort of a crisis. Getting fired from radio, it was and is a really fun opportunity that I've learned a lot from, but it's not as baked into what I think of, what I want to be good at. And maybe there's a little bit of that too, of I'm writing query letters to places like Slate and Salon, GQ, and not hearing back, that maybe that hurts a little bit more than hearing someone say I'm terrible on the radio or use the word like too many times, where I'm like, yeah, that might be true, but man, I didn't train to do this. Like, I'm supposed to be good at writing. So that's probably another subject, though. I've done enough about sort of my ideals or my tests. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. If you did, feel free to let me know. And if you didn't, like, feel free to let me know too. Like, again, it's some of this is me talking about my internal process, and I'm interested in doing that, but I can understand why other people wouldn't be interested in hearing about it and would be like, hey, talk some Russell Wilson. Tell me about Kyler Murray. So if you got feelings about the subject matter, don't hesitate. You can always reach me on Twitter, email. It is Danny O'Neill. I have a newsletter, the Dang Apostrophe, that I'd love for you to sign up for at Substack, or you can listen to the podcast right here wherever you get podcasts.